My name is Sharon Knoll. I'm the Executive Director at the Warwick Historical Society, and it is a pleasure to have you all here this evening. Up until just a little bit ago, I didn't know anything about the Lewis Woodlands. And I came home and told my husband, I said, you're not going to believe this, but there is this hidden gem in Warwick. We pass by it all the time, and we have no idea that it's there. I'm not sure he believed me, but one day, after receiving snowshoes for Christmas, he took off in Lewis Woodlands. And while he can tell you about the experience firsthand at the end of this evening, he's the handsome man with the beard and the plaid shirt. You can get a first-hand accounting, but let me tell you, he came home beaming. And it was the first place when the weather broke that he took our 6-year-old granddaughter, who could not hold back her enthusiasm for every path, every pine cone, every piece of birch bark on the ground. So you have a real treat in store for you this evening. Maybe you all know where it is, maybe you've all been there. My most recent trip there was for Arbor Day. And there were about 70 children there who sang America the Beautiful. And what a moment. So I just want to tell you that it is a pleasure for the Warwick Historical Society to host an event that will introduce the community to such a wonderful, wonderful place, a real mystery and a gem. If I could take just a moment to introduce Gert Galligan to you. Gert is part of the Warwick Valley Gardeners, and would also like to take just a moment to welcome you here.
Very much. Can you hear me? Remember at meetings I always hear, we can't hear you. So I'm always wondering if people can hear me. The Lewis Woodlands, I think it was late February, early March, when I received a call from Michael Newport. And I remember it very clearly because my son had come up with his girlfriend. And it was the first time we met her, and I was out. And so when I came down, my son said to me, you got a call, and you're supposed to call back. And I said, okay, who was it? And he said, the mayor. And my son's girlfriend said, what? The mayor? And I said, well, this is a small town. But anyway, Michael was telling me about this project in the Lewis Woodlands and refurbishing it, and would the garden club be interested in having part in it. And so we went over one day and we took the walk through it, and when I saw it, I said, this is absolutely, like Sharon had said, a gem, really. If any of you have not been there, you must go up there and you must go in and walk the trails. There are several trails there. So I said, I would like to do it very much. Let me go back to the club and talk to them. Everyone was very receptive. And we've been talking a long time about not having pollinators. And we know that that's a real problem, because if you don't have pollinators, you don't have plants that will fruit, you will not have flowers, and eventually you will not have food. So this is a really big problem, which we are now feel like instead of just talking about the problem, we're going to become part of the solution. And we're going to go over there and we're going to put it in a pollinator's garden, and we hope that will be fruit.
What are you going to do?
We're going to put in a pollinator's garden. We're going to plant, milkweed and things that will attract pollinators. And so now, the next person who's going to talk to you, I think, is probably the hardest working man in the village. I think his office extends from the village hall all the way down Main Street, right? Because it's always open season. So I'm really very, very proud and honored to introduce Mayor Michael.
Thank you, Kurt. And thank you, gardeners, and the Historical Society for hosting this tonight.
Louder.
Louder? Okay.
Yes,
Can you hear me now? What a lucky child to grow up with the Lewis Woodlands in their backyard. From a very early age, really beginning, it was my playground and my friend's playground. And to think about that experience now, it was pretty magical. It was pretty interesting. It's not like it is today. It's been cleaned up a bit. It was a little bit more rough. It was a little bit more overgrown. It was a bit more mysterious even. And so imagine a young boy and his friends digging in the mud and finding a piece of marble bench and thinking that they had found Greece. It was there, you know. We know, we discovered it. And think about the incredible flora and fauna that exists on what was originally a cultured woodland. Things that would exist not really in our nature, but existed because they were planted there. We didn't know, but they were all fascinating, they were all beautiful, they were all incredible. But it was really the natural part, I think, that we loved the most. It was crayfish in the stream. It was a large snapping turtle that we dragged all the way up to Maple Avenue. About the size of that table. My friends Mav and Rennie Bradner, and their father was shocked when we dragged it all the way up to the house. And it was a very intimate space as well. And I think about even the fragrance. I was just down there the other day, and the fragrance of the pachysandra. Now that's interesting. I've been to that woodland so many times, and I always smell this wonderful smell at this time of year. And I think, what the heck is that? I mean, it's not the daffodils. It's not what could be smelling so strong. There's a large patch of pachysandra. I was like, could it be that? And I picked a piece, and it was that. And it was beautiful. It was a very fragrant smell, and I was completely shocked. So you're always learning something, right? But I remember mostly the forget-me-nots that are kind of naturalized along the stream. And I shared that memory with my dear good friend, Sis Palmer, who actually grew up in the same place, and Ruth Fowler. And we shared those memories. They were a couple decades older than me, but they had played there, and they knew the same ground. And it was such a wonderful thing in life to say, oh, do you remember that? Do you remember those rocks there? Or do you remember the flowers that were grown there? Or, you know, all those things that you could share with a whole other generation. So it was wonderful in that it tied people together. And to hear their stories, because their stories were the real stories. They were the family that grew up there and lived there. It was their grandmother, and they knew this place like the back of their hands, and they had all those wonderful stories that they would tell us as children and then as young adults. And it's a wonderful legacy to have been left. I'm excited about tonight because Dick has done a lot of research. If you've never been there, I do hope you will go. You know, it's a village park. We were given this property by the Orange and Duchess Garden Club. Dick will give you more of the history of that. And we have plans, and you know, we're hoping to partner, of course, with the gardeners, with sustainable work, and do some really proactive, really good things. Partially things like a pollinator garden, which is environmental, but also restoration, because it's a very important historic place. And the first thing we did when we received the ownership of the property was we applied for a grant and received it, and it was for historical landscapes. And so we had a study done immediately, and that is in that binder, and I think there's another copy on the back table. And it sort of gives us a blueprint of how we can move towards a partial restoration and also historical signage. So it gives people a true experience of what was there. You know, a great sense of, you know, this is bigger than just the little parts that you see. It was really something quite elaborate. So we're hoping to move towards that. Sadly enough, Sandy came into town and wreaked havoc on a quarter of the woodland. And we are still trying to catch our breath from that. There are so many trees that came down, and that's part of it. It's a woodland that was not really fully maintained because of the cost of maintaining it. So there was no forestry program of, moving, older wood, older trees, planting new trees. So once we get through Sandy, the leftovers of Sandy, we're hoping that we can put that into place. I just want to point one thing out. I left some of the things from the village coffers on the piano. And this is, to me, the most fascinating thing. And it is the planting journal from the Bowers. And it's by the year. So it starts in 1905. So gardeners, I'm sure you'd be very interested in this. It's also in the archive of the Historical Society. But it's fascinating to see what they actually planted and the type of species. And here are 5 Norway. We'll get this quickly, and I'll let Dick start. So I know he's chomping at the bit. Let's see. Oh, even European larch, English junipers, balsam firs, Austrian pines, white pines, Scotch pines, white cedars, arborvitae, white spruces, Douglas spruces, Norway spruces, black spruces, cucumber magnolia, American mountain ash, and it goes on. And it's really interesting. It's good reading if you love horticulture and love plants. So anyway, I would like to introduce my good friend, Dr. Richard Holm, and he's going to open up the experience of Lewis Woodlands to all of us. Thank you.
Well, our Honorable Mayor is right. This Woodlands is indeed a mystical and magical land. And it's right here in Warwick. And it's been saved, and it will always be there. And I think that's really neat. Well, back in September, I was asked by the Warwick Valley Gardeners to give a talk on gardening, history of gardening, horticulture. And I think out of that grew a request for me to come and talk a little bit about the Lewis Woodlands, gardening in the Lewis Woodlands. Well, I'm certainly not the world's expert on gardening or gardening in the Lewis Woodlands, but I have done some research on it off and on over the years, and what I want to do tonight is to share some of that. Since that September talk, I was looking at every quarterly, I go over and review the lectures I've given over the last quarter of the year. And this is my 70th lecture now, since September 14th, when I spoke to the Warwick Valley Gardeners over at the Senior Center.
I don't think the mic is working. We just hear your
There's a
natural
nod,
voice.
so let's see.
It is.
Hello?
Yeah.
Maybe I'll speak more directly. In fact, I should do that tonight because one of the pitfalls of being a professional historian and archivist for that matter is that you, from time to time, have to get into old files, and musty, moldy old files. And I'm into a lot of them now because I'm finishing nearly 50 years of teaching at NYU, going to retirement. I got to leave my office on campus, close it down, and I need to decide what files I want to keep. So I've been going through files that I haven't opened in over, well, nearly half a century. And somehow some of those spores jumped out of those files and jumped right down my throat and into my vocal folds about a month ago. And I still haven't got my voice back in. So I apologize tonight if I'm a bit raspy and hoarse. But I'm not so hoarse that I can't speak. As my sister, my older sister said tonight as we were coming over here, she said, Dick, when you were a little kid, you worried because you never spoke. You were very quiet. And my father was a doctor, was quite concerned about little Dickie, he just doesn't speak. And then one day I started talking. When I was, how old, Nancy? Maybe 4 or 5. And Miss Nancy said, and Dick, you never stopped since. They can't shut you off, shut you down. Anyway, so what I want to do, I want to start by looking at the prehistory of Warwick Woodlands. And not too many weeks ago, Marianne Knight and Ivy Toole and I were over at the Sanfordville School talking about Indians of Warwick. And Marianne had all the kids shut their eyes and imagine what Warwick must have been like during the Indian period. And she kind of took them on a vicarious trip through the town. So that's kind of what I want to start out doing right now. I want you to, you don't have to shut your eyes, but just say, well, you can if you like, but just imagine what Warwick Woodlands must have been like in the period. Imagine if you were in India, you're coming up Main Street here, which was the Wawianda path. You veered off to the right, you continued along the Wawianda path, a few hundred yards north of here on what is now Colonial Avenue. And then you kind of moseyed off to the left. You walked into this strange area. And topographically, it was quite interesting, different, because here was a tremendous volume of limestone outcroppings, and a karst area, an area of dissolving limestone, and underneath this outcropping, water would run, and that water cut caves. And talk to Johnny Sanford, for example, and he'll tell you when he was a boy, behind the Landmark Inn, there was a cave there, a four-chambered cavern, and then you could walk from there down toward the village. Now, George Hansen, who also lived in that area, just maybe to the north of Warwick Woodlands, told me once many years ago, the late George Hansen, as a boy, he was able to walk from what is today the Landmark Inn, the old Conrad Sly House, all the way down to the mobile gas station across the street, underground. So this was obviously a land of great fascination, not only to Michael and his generation, but many generations before that time. Now, I think it's important to remember that the Indians were really not farmers. Of course, they had been hunters and gatherers for many tens of generations. Indians had occupied this area for at least 11,000 years. But they were introduced to the planting of vegetables as early, I would say, probably about 1100, 900 to 1100 AD. And many of these crops, these vegetables, had originated in Central and South America, came up through the American Southwest and eastward across the Mississippi into the eastern area here, the coastal area, and ultimately up here into the Warwick area. And that was interesting because up until that time, Indian population growth was probably near zero. Many of them starved to death in the wintertime, the lack of food. But with their ability now to plant some, to them must have been miracle crops, like beans, like squash, like corn, maize, they were able to produce a surplus. And they found ways of preserving, storing many of these vegetables. And so if you walk through this area, Warwick Woodland, let's say in about the 1400s, you would probably see Indians in there. But their interest in what is today Warwick Woodland really wasn't mainly for horticulture, for gardens. As I said before, they were becoming horticulturists, not farmers, and the vegetable gardeners. But they were looking at this woodlands, all of the trees. This was a heavy limestone content, the soil, very productive, yet not very good for certainly for farming. In fact, what is say the Warwick Woodlands, I don't believe was ever part of any cultivated farmland. It was just too difficult to pull machinery up and down through these nooks and crannies, crevices, and so forth. But lots of trees, many species of trees. For example, birch trees. There are a few birch trees in there still surviving today. They're huge. They're well over 100, 150 years old, I would guess. And the Indians liked those birch trees, of course, because they could peel the birch off those trees and make their canoes, which they would bring right down here to the Wawianda, get in the canoes, and go off down the Wawianda, down into what is Sussex, New Jersey, and then northward into what is today Pine Island. And of course, the Wawianda joins the Wallkill, and the Wallkill flows northward. Interestingly, very few rivers in the east here flow northward, and empties, of course, into the Hudson River. But they also found poplar trees, we believe, in the Warwick Woodlands. Poplar trees provided them with thicker bark and better material to build larger canoes that they could use in other types of water, so they could even barter with Indians along the Hudson and Delaware rivers. They also saw the Warwick Woodlands as a kind of Aiken's drugstore. This was nature's pharmacy. There were willow trees in there. There were all kinds of species of trees that had medicinal properties. So, and the local Indians here, the Lenape Indians, the women tended to be the pharmacists. It was the women who went into these woodlands and understood these trees, recognized them for their medicinal value. So I think we can imagine that that's what was going on in Warwick Woodlands in the Indian period. I should also say too that they like chestnut trees as well for their tasty nuts that they would roast. And there were walnut trees, other nut-bearing trees as well. So this was kind of a neat place, I'm sure, for Indians of all ages, young ones and old ones. And of course, they had no plows. That's another reason why this really wasn't conducive, really to any kind of farming at any time in history. The Indians didn't have plows. But there are parts of the Warwick Woodlands you can see where crops could have been cultivated. And there, undoubtedly, you might have found at that time musk melons, in addition to the beans, the squash, and corn. They were the three most important crops. And they did a lot of intercropping. And the corn stalks would be kept and would be like poles supporting the beans. It would grow up and wind around the corn stalks. They were very clever about that. But you would also have found growing in there musk melons. This is, let's say, by the 1600s. Musk melons, watermelons, sunflowers, Jerusalem artichokes, and perhaps by the 1400s, calabashes and gourds, which they would, of course, use to carry water into their gardens. Some grew strawberries. There was also milkweed in there. And I would guess there were a number of crabapple trees as well. This is just to mention a few of the crops. So the Indian diet was varied, and they could obtain a good deal of sustenance, sustainability, just from that Warwick Woodlands area. Area today covers about 14 acres, I believe. Is that right? Well, it's about 14 acres. Okay, now they also now water. There's a creek, a little stream runs along the western perimeter of Warwick Woodlands. That's called Witch's Creek. And Witch's Creek rises on the Jimmy Baird Farm, just to the north. Well, the Baird Farm runs along Ackerman Road, north of Warwick Woodlands. And there are some powerful springs up there. They're still fairly low. Our water table here has dropped considerably in the last 150 years or so, but it still furnishes a great deal of water, a fast-moving water. And so the Indians like that as well, because then they could just, dry season, they could just walk down to that creek, and with their calabashes, they could pick up that water and bring it up and water their beans and their squash and corn and so forth. Okay, so so native gardens were planted. I don't see much evidence of Indians getting into flowers. Now they may have, but and some of you may correct me on this because there's a lot of you here who know a lot more about gardening than I do. But I don't have a sense that Indians were out planting flowers and picking flowers and putting them in vases on tables and floors and homes and so forth. I just can't. That's not part of my the historian's imagination here. Okay, now let's move on to the colonial period. What happens during the colonial period? Well, Warwick begins to be settled in the early 1700s. This becomes part of a huge Wawayanda land patent of over 20,000 acres of land. The first European house was built by the Stats family. It still stands. My parents bought it back in 1949, just a few miles outside of the village here. And gradually, Europeans began to come in here. Benjamin Ask settles down here in what would become ultimately Warwick Village. The Wisners, of course, to the west of the South Florida, Edenville, and so forth. But the Europeans come in. But as again, I don't see any evidence of much disturbance in what we know is the Warwick Woodlands today by these farmers. But land was important. Many of the patentees of the Wawayanda land patent weren't interested in farming. Most of them lived down in New York or in Albany. They were interested in the potential of iron production up in this area, and they were interested in holding that land for a time when maybe whites would come up here, Europeans would come up, and then they could subdivide. And of course, that's what began to happen, considerable subdivision. And there would be arguments over boundaries. Surveyors were very important people. One of the most distinguished people ever who lived in Warwick, of course, was John Hathel. And he was a well-known surveyor from Pennsylvania who came up here, started surveying land, fell in love with a young lady up here, and got married and built that lovely stone house down off of Route 94, south of us here. But anyway, New Jersey, the province of New Jersey, East Jersey, and New York struggled over the boundary, over their land boundaries. So it wasn't just private land boundaries, but colonial provincial boundaries. And from 1719, there emerged what came to be called the Line War. And there were a series of skirmishes. In fact, they actually went back and even a little before 1715. 1719, things really began to get nasty. Farmers began beating up on each other and arguing over just where is the boundary between New York and New Jersey. And it finally got so bad that in the 1760s, King George established a World Boundary Commission to try to determine once and for all where this boundary would be set. But already there had been surveyors up here, and one well-known surveyor started surveying across the Hudson River in Dutchess County and drew a line from there all the way out westward to the Delaware River. And lo and behold, when you come in to Warwick Woodlands from Robin Bray, you go over the creek, and on the left-hand side, you're going to see a pile of stones there. And I always thought those stones had just been dumped there at some point. Some truck just dumped them there. But lo and behold, a man from Middletown called me one day and invited me to come down to Warwick Woodlands because he wanted to show me his stone cairn. I came down, I said, oh, I know all about pile of stones. He said, no, you don't. You didn't know anything about those stones. That is a very important boundary marker. And this surveyor came through here, and every certain number of miles, he established these boundary markers. So what that pile of stones is over there is a boundary marker that was set up over 200, well over 300, almost 300 years ago. And so that is historically an important thing about Warwick Woodlands, and you should all be aware. So when you enter the Warwick Woodlands with your students or friends, you should look at that pile of stones, because it does have great historical significance. But the issue, the boundary issue, became so critical and so important that King George set up a special boundary commission, and finally an agreement was reached in 1769, not long before the American Revolution, but not before a lot of farmers had beaten each other up over boundary law, and surveys too. Okay, now let's jump. Let's take a big leap now into the 19th century. And now we're going to see a man by the name of Benjamin F. Dunning. B.F. Dunning. B.F. Dunning was a very smart and very interesting guy. Dunning was born out in Minnesota, town of Minnesota. He was an Orange County native, born there in 1819. He went to Union College, which was one of the best undergraduate colleges in America at the time, and still is an outstanding school, and he graduated in the class of 1840. Dunning then, and would read law. And Dunning opened a law practice in Goshen, and it was an overnight success. This guy was charming. He loved people. He could convince people of just about anything. Extremely persuasive guy, but very meticulous, extremely meticulous, and had huge, very strong powers of observation. And after a while, Dunning said, hey, you know, I want to set my sights even higher than Goshen. I mean, he'd already founded a volunteer fire company in Goshen, one of the first in Orange County. He was very civic-minded. But off he goes to New York City. And in the early 50s, back in 1853, he opens a law practice in New York. And it was extremely successful from the get-go. And he gets into politics. He gets into high society down there. This boy, this young man from Orange County. And in the 1870s, he was the district attorney for New York City. And he was apparently a very handsome, very debonair guy. Okay, so let's stop for a moment. We've got B.F. Dunning down there in New York, building a law practice, schmoozing with all the elites down there, the social, political, and legal elites, developing an outstanding reputation for his great legal mind. Now comes Joseph Belcher. Joseph Belcher, and this actually is my family as well, because I am a descendant of Adam Belcher, who one time on what is today much of Tuxedo Park, but in centuries ago, that was mined for iron, some of this part of that area. And Adam Belcher was an iron miner. He had an iron mining business. And Adam had two sons. One was, I'm a direct descendant of, but the other one came over to Warwick, Joseph Belcher. And he establishes a farm called Locust Hill Farm. Locust Hill Farm, the house that he built is a beautiful Georgian framed house next to the former King's School. That becomes Locust Hill Farm, and of course, many of you may know that interesting cemetery across the street on King's Highway, the Locust Hill Cemetery. Okay, well, Belcher's wife dies quite suddenly. He becomes a widower, and he marries another woman by the name of Ruth Seeley. Now, Ruth Seeley had already been married. Her husband, I guess, had died, I think, but I can't swear. Anyway, I'm not going to probe too deeply into that, but she maintains the name of Seeley, however. Her mother continues for that name, and so does she, even though she becomes Belcher. Now, she marries in the late 1850s B.F. Dunning. And B.F. Dunning comes up here. I don't know how they meet, but he comes up here and he's introduced to Warwick. He'd never really been to Warwick before, I don't believe. But he comes to Warwick and he buys land on Maple Avenue, on the left side of Maple Avenue. And he becomes, by this time he's already very successful. He's going to be a very wealthy guy. And so he and his wife lay out this wonderful weekend and summer retreat up here. They built a beautiful home. And next door is a guy by a fellow by the name of McGinsey, M.J. McGinsey. Now, McGinsey loves gardens. And McGinsey himself builds a beautiful home. And young Ruth and her husband, B.F. Dunning, are very impressed by what Jinsey is doing. And so they go out and they build these huge greenhouses, these conservatories. And it is said that they were the first private conservatories in Orange County. This is before the Civil War. And they get into horticulture. And they get into it in a very, very big way, in fact. They have in their conservatory, they have enormous quantities of roses, different varieties of roses, carnations. Mrs. Dunning loves carnations. She grows also, she has Amazonian lilacs. She has many varieties of lilacs, Amazonian lilacs. And what they would do is they would, once the railroad came through in 1860, they would load up a freight car and take some of their plantings down to New York, and for his offices as well as for their home in Manhattan. So it's very interesting. So now we begin to see the Dunnings establishing this beautiful estate, which comes to be called Valley Home, with its greenhouses, with 40,000 plants under glass by the time of the Civil War. Or Roman hyacinths, that's what I was thinking of. She also grew Roman hyacinths and a variety of geraniums, and one could go on and on. But you see, to understand the history of Warwick Woodland, you have to look at the Dunnings. Because then what happens is that there's a young man by the name of Thomas Powell Fowler. Now, Thomas Powell Fowler was part of the famous Powell family of Newburgh. Now, the Powells got very early into transportation, and they were the founders in 1802 of what came to be called the Hudson Bay Line. And they built these beautiful ships. In fact, my wife's great-grandfather would build some of their ships in Newburgh. He had a shipyard business in Newburgh. And they would run these ships back and forth and between New York and ultimately Albany. And they made a lot of money. The Powells made a lot of money, and the Fowlers married into the Powell family. And young Thomas Powell Fowler was educated what was then one of the best private schools in Newburgh, and then he's sent off to Germany, and he studies at Heidelberg University in Germany. This is in the early 1870s, late 60s. And he's very impressed because in Heidelberg at that time that he was there, they were beginning to lay out street trees, shade trees along their major roads. They were redesigning the grid of the city of Heidelberg. So he gets a German education in Heidelberg. And the family, interesting, that the Fowler family also get into transportation and a lot of other businesses in Newburgh at the time of Newburgh's golden era. And they built quite an estate there. And apparently they used the services of a man by the name of Andrew Jackson Downing. Now, Andrew Jackson Downing becomes one of the most famous landscape architects in America in his day. And he's very, very successful. And his family his father already had established a large nursery in Newburgh. And the Fowlers did a lot of business. Apparently he helped to landscape their estate. And so young Thomas Powell Fowler himself becomes interested in plants, in horticulture. Well, to make a long story, and Fowler then goes on to Columbia University, Columbia College, and graduates from law school there in the class of 1874. Now, Fowler is hired into Dunning's law practice because Fowler was one of the top graduates of law in his school, his class, law school. And he joins the Dunning firm. And Dunning kind of adopts Thomas Powell Fowler, almost like his son. Now, by this time, railroads were getting underway. Railroads were being built all over the place. And Fowler decides to specialize in railroad litigation, railroad consolidation, and so forth. And there were a lot of accidents on railroads in those days, so there was always litigation all the time. And Dunning's firm is making more and more money. Fowler is brought into the firm and ultimately into the business. And Dunning has this young daughter. And he said, you know, you two really need to get together. Why don't you come up to Warwick next weekend and spend the weekend and spend some time with my daughter. So Fowler comes to Warwick, a young man, fresh out of college, going rapidly in the Dunning, in the law practice in New York. And he meets this young woman, and they fall in love very quickly, and they get married. And now the Dunnings already had on Maple Avenue an English gardener. And this English gardener knew trees. He knew trees. He knew specimen trees that grew all over the world, especially in the British Isles and in America and in France. There were a lot of trees native to France, that region. Well, he begins to plant shade trees. He goes crazy. If you look at the 1875 Atlas of Orange County and turn to the section on Warwick, there's a wonderful drawing of the B.F. Dunning estate, because this estate was really something else. So people from all over Orange County would come. And the Dunnings loved to have parties. Their doors were always open. They invited people in, oh, come in, and come on out, we'll show you some of our plants, our plantings in the conservatory, and so forth. And in 1866, Warwick establishes a cemetery. And you all know the cemetery, it still exists. You go through that beautiful iron gateway next to the Warwick Country Club and down into the Warwick Cemetery. Well, those of you who have visited Warwick Cemetery, you might be interested in those lovely tombstones and the mausoleums, but what really fascinates me about the Warwick Cemetery is trees. It's trees. And there actually is a guide to the trees of the Warwick Cemetery. And this guy apparently went crazy. When the Cemetery Association was founded, everybody wanted to have their people buried in the Warwick Cemetery. They started emptying out graveyards all over the valley here, digging up their ancestors and moving them down to the Warwick Cemetery so they could be planted underneath one of those fantastic trees that were being planted in the late 1860s and 1870s, 80s, and 90s in that Warwick Cemetery. And many of them are still there today. Why? Because those roads were not disturbed. Those grounds were left undisturbed. Salt wasn't spread over those roads to cut ice and so forth, and many trees can't, of course, tolerate quantities of salt. So those trees, and they were cared for, they were well cared for. So I really recommend a nice Sunday visit to, quiet day visit to Warwick Cemetery. So that kind of connects up with the Dunning family as well. Okay, so Fowler comes up, falls in love with young Miss Dunning, Ruth Dunning, and they get married. And they get married in 1876. Now, she is very fond of her mother. They're very close. And the two of them, even more than B.F. Dunning, because he's too busy, but the two of them really became quite expert in gardening and in horticulture. Now, she talks Fowler into buying the, Jean May is here, the Burke property. Miss Burke had a little house across the street. And by the way, I should stop for a moment because I should really recognize our village historian, Jean Cushman Beatty May, who is an expert on Warwick history and indeed on the Fowlers and Bel Air. And she has always been enormous help to me in my research, as well as Sue Gardner. And you probably know Sue, she's an archivist and works at the Wisdom Public Library. So a lot of credit really needs to go to Jean, whose family, the Beatties, also had an estate just 2 doors down from the Dunning estate. Their house they built, Jean, in 1890. And that was a Dietrich house built by a famous architect who designed many of Warwick's houses at that time. Well, anyway, okay, so let's get back to the Dunnings and the Fowlers. So they buy this property, about 37, 38 acres across the street. And Fowler, by that time, is making a lot of money, and so he builds this gorgeous house that I think is a DJ house, wasn't it?
No, I don't think it was.
Was not.
No. It was taken from Miss Burt's house and enlarged by Mr. Galloway.
Built over the Burt house,
Yeah.
virtually from that footprint, so to speak. But anyway, it becomes quite a lovely house. Additions are built, I think most recently 1910, I think was the large addition. Beautiful verandas, these lovely porches that wrap around the house, and little porches on the second floor, all of some of the bedrooms and so forth. It was really a huge house. Probably not one of the most beautiful houses architecturally, at least in my childhood memory. I never thought of it as being particularly beautiful, but it was certainly large, a very large house. And Michael has shown you the guide of their plantings. And that was what, 1903, 1905, I think? But actually, they bought that property in 1885, and within about 2 years, they were already beginning to plant. And that was partly because, I think, of the influence of Mrs. Dunning, and of course her daughter, Fowler's wife. But they were very anxious to get things started, get things underway. But they really didn't get into it big time until the first decade of the 20th century. Now, Fowler rises very quickly in his practice. He becomes one of the great legal minds in railroad management, railroad litigation. He travels all over the United States. He becomes president of the New York, Ontario, and Western Railway at the age of, I think, 35 or 36, one of the youngest railroad presidents in America, leading to large-sized railroads. He goes on, he becomes a director of many, many railroads throughout the United States, including what would become the Santa Fe Railroad. His vision extended from here out to the Pacific. In other words, played a very, very important role in that regard. He becomes chief legal counsel for the West Shore Railroad. It ran northward out of New Jersey, I think from Jersey City, up along the west shore of the Hudson River, right into Newburgh City and beyond. So Fowler and his wife built a beautiful home off of Fifth Avenue, 36 East 68th Street. Beautiful townhouse, surrounded by the Morgans and the Rockefellers and all the leading families of America are building these big mansions up and down Fifth Avenue, either side of Fifth Avenue. I mean, they were really right up there. But Fowler and his wife loved Warwick. They loved Warwick. And they would come up here as often as they possibly could. Fowler even died here in Warwick at a very young age in 1915. And at his home here. They called their estate Bel Air, B-E-L-A-I-R. We aren't sure where that name, how they came up with that name, but they were francophonic peoples. They loved France and French culture. The nanny, they had a prominent nanny who took care of the kids, and she was, what, Miss Buffet, I think was her name, Buffet or something like that. She taught them French, and she was very highly respected. And Harold Wilson, who many of you know has been active in the Warwick Historical Society with his wife for many, many decades. Harold is still alive. It was Harold's uncle, Clarence Wilson, who was the chief caretaker of Bel Air and put an enormous amount of time and effort into it. One of their children's middle name is Wilson, and I wouldn't be surprised if that name came from Clarence Wilson. I know he was their caretaker for at least 4 decades. Now, the Fowlers began to travel. And at the turn of the century, a number of Warwick people were beginning to travel overseas. In fact, a whole delegation, the members of the village board and trustees, were invited by Warwick, England to celebrate their 1000th birthday. And almost all the members of the village board in 1902, I think, or something like that. Wisner was the mayor at that time. And they all got in a boat and off they went to Warwick, England for the celebrations there, and then stayed on and became very interested in Warwick Gardens. And and architecture, and brought back a lot of ideas, still more ideas, more influence. Okay, so as the Fowlers began to travel, especially through Europe, through Western Europe, they would always bring back with them specimens, plants, trees, flowers, and so forth. They'd bring them back and they would plant them on their estate here in Bel Air. And they would send Clarence out to the mountains, to that area where the rhododendrons grow. If you're going along the Warwick Turnpike, across the mountain down into West Milford, and on either side when I was a kid, there were just wild rhododendrons everywhere. And I think they're still growing in that area. I haven't been as observant recently, but Clarence would go out and he would scour the mountains here, collecting rhododendrons, all kinds of native plants and ferns. They loved ferns, and would bring them back and would put them in. And by 1905, the Fowlers had built their own conservatories as well, and they were just chock full of specimen trees and plants, virtually from all over this area, all over the Northeast, all over Europe. I mean, it was really amazing. And the whole estate was just a showpiece, because then they laid out Italianate gardens, formal gardens. This was a period that the Warwickians were becoming interested in the 1890s, into the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Everybody in Warwick was interested in the rusticity, in the rustic things. You know, we've kind of come back full circle, haven't we? We had Dan back today, who was a leading American builder of rustic furniture. And we've come full circle. As Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does wrong. So anyway, they were into rustic things, and the Fowlers loved rusticity, rustic things. So they hired people to come in to build rustic gazebos, rustic bridges made of natural woods, rough woods. They built walls of stone without any more uncut stone. Now, but they were in a transitional period, like so many wealthy Americans at that time. They loved the rustic things. I mean, they built in the 1890s the Reformed Church up the street. Have you ever seen the Reformed Church facade there? That's all rough stone. It's not quarry cut stone. And so the Fowlers, it was like they had this fancy place in New York. They had this place out in the country. Bel Air was a mixture of the ornate, of the formal, and the very informal. So you had a deliberate attempt to keep one part of the estate, that had all this limestone, these rocky crevices, keep that natural, and plant natural things there. Keep it natural. But on the other side of the Witch's Creek, let's really have formal fountains and statues like the one that Michael stumbled across and thought he had arrived in Athens, Greece, in ancient Greece or wherever. I mean, these amazing fountains, this beautiful pool that still exists. If you walk down to the end of Robin Gray, which, as you know, is a cul-de-sac, if you go just another 50 feet or so, you'll see this large circular, is it circular oval? I think it's circular pool that the Fowlers built, and it had this beautiful fountain in the center of it. It's still there, but it's falling into the state of past disrepair. Anyway, so you had the formality and the informality. You had beautifully cut stone gate posts coming into the State House, but from Maple Avenue, but if you come up Colonial Avenue and turn into where Jeffrey and Carol Howard lived, and if you look at the old Rutherford house, that beautiful Georgian brick house right on the road, if you look at that stone wall, and if you look at those beautiful gates to that Georgian mansion and into the Howard property, you will see what I'm talking about. That was all rough stone, roughly cut stone. And amazingly, those big gates are still, not the gates themselves, but the gate posts, those stone posts are still standing. Steve Gross, the family that lived just beyond here, the Van Duzer family, also built, the Benedicts built those beautiful stone posts that are still on your property. You can still see on your semicircular driveway. And of course, that road, that straight road that leads up into the Howard property in the rear, was the back road into the Bel Air estate. Okay, so what else can I say about that? Oh, yes. Yeah, Helena Rutherford Ely. Helena Rutherford Ely, Rutherford, you ever heard the name Rutherford? The Rutherfords were into railroading too. Warwick was a town of railroad people. It was Fowler, by the way, who, when the Warwick Valley Railroad was merged and expanded into what would become the Lehigh and Hudson River Railroad, he and Grinnell Burke, another railroad genius, great far-sighted man who was born and raised right over here in Belleville and became a very successful lawyer and railroad man and president of, I guess, he was president, wasn't he, for a while of the railroad here. This town was filled with these guys. Fowler was the one who established the railroad yards for the Lehigh and Hudson River Railroad in Warwick, very convenient. And he had his own beautiful, opulent railroad car, number 30. It was named Warwick, wasn't it? The car itself, fully furnished, with kitchen, living room, bedrooms, and everything. And he would travel all over the place, all over the country, in this incredible railway car that still exists. It's not too many years ago. It was restored. Unfortunately, it's somewhere in western New York State. I'm not sure just where it is now. But anyway, Rutherford was also into railroads. He was a wealthy man too. And Helena Rutherford Ely was surely influenced by the Dunnings and the Fowlers. Surely influenced by them. Because the families were all socially interconnected. They saw each other all the time. And she went on, and they built this beautiful estate on the southern end of Warwick, right on the New Jersey line, called Meadowgarden. And Helena there sets up her own formal gardens. These gardens become very famous. She goes on and founds the Garden Club of America. And she also writes in 1903 a book entitled A Woman's Hardy Garden. Some of you may have read this book. It offered practical horticultural advice. And that book sold hundreds of thousands of copies. Everyone knew about Helena Rutherford. Anyone who was a gardener knew about Mrs. Ely and about Meadowgarden. People from all over the United States would come to see her gardens. And her gardens were like Clarence Wilson. They had a gardener named Mr. Furman. I can't think of his first name. Mr. Furman? I've forgotten. But he became their gardener as a young boy, young man, and remained her gardener well into his old age. And then his son took over, and he became their gardener as well. 2 generations, and he lived into an old age as well. I mean, they're amazing. The continuity here was really incredible.
And the nephew took over from there.
And the nephew took over from there. Amazing. So, and the gardens are still down there at Meadowgarden. Okay, so then we speed on a little bit further, and we come to the Sanfords. Now, the Sanfords were one of Warwick's oldest families, going back before the American Revolution. They made their money mainly in farming, very successful farmers, and they got into the dairy business. When the railroad came through Warwick, Warwick became like the Abu Dhabi of southern New York State, certainly on this side of the river. And everybody then went from very diversified farming into dairy farming, dairy. Practically every farmer transformed his farm into a dairy. And this became an enormously profitable milk-producing area. And the railroad was actually built with Warwick money. Originally, it was laid out and opened in 1860. Warwick capital, Warwick expertise, Warwick management, ownership, and everything. And so they could take their milk down to the railroad. There were depots, little stations all along the railroad here. Farmers would unload their milk, they'd put them on the cars and zip them off to New York. And New Yorkers had an insatiable appetite, thirst for this milk here. Because this was a time when immigrants by the millions were flooding into New York from Central Europe and Southern Europe, areas where people consumed voraciously dairy products, cheese, butter, milk, and our soil was perfect for this. Our cows produced a lot, and the milk quality was very high. It brought very, very good prices in New York. And so many of the farmers really became quite wealthy. And the Hortons, for example, from the Goshen area, founded the Horton Ice Cream Company. Now, Horton was kind of like the McDonald's. The Horton ice cream bars were like McDonald's. Up until Mr. Horton, very few people consumed ice cream. You had to have a lot of money to afford to have ice cream as a dessert. It was a specialty item that only wealthy people could afford. Horton developed, or he had someone develop a process for him to mass produce ice cream, and he opens up these ice cream places all over the countryside, and he makes a fortune. The Horton Ice Cream Company becomes, by 1905-06, already a multi-million-dollar business. And there's another family, the Bordens, a little further north of us. They were getting into milk and milk product business and making a huge fortune as well. Well, Horton marries a Sanford. Horton comes down here and marries a Sanford. And that family marries into the Lewis family. The Lewises were farmers just over the border in northern New Jersey. And the Sanfords also become quite interested in trees especially, but also in horticulture and in gardening. Their farm is called Maple Terrace Farm. It's still in existence. The Sanfords still live in that house and still own the farm. As you probably know, they still farm, actually. It's quite amazing. It's just on the northern border here of the village. Now, I forgot to mention was that through the influence of the Dunnings, and probably their English gardener helped out with this, Warwick began to plant shade trees, street trees, not just for aesthetic reasons, not because it's beautiful to have trees along the streets, but why else would they have done it? Think for a moment. Why did they go crazy planting shade trees in all the major thoroughfares leading down to the railroad? Shade the milk wagons, to shade the milk wagons, so they wouldn't be exposed to the direct rays of the sun in the summertime. A very practical reason. And so from the 1840s, Roe Gradner's the first to begin to plant the shade trees. The Dunnings picked up on it. And all these streets, now that's how Maple Avenue, the name has changed to Maple Avenue in the late 1870s. And there's Linden Street, and there's, all these streets, so many of these streets in the village, even outside the village, are named after trees. And these trees are planted along these great thoroughfares. And Warwick becomes like Tree City, even before Tree City was even founded. And I remember as a boy, back in the late 40s and early 50s, you could drive down Maple Avenue, coming into Maple Avenue at about the Sanford Farm and the Warwick Village line, and Maple Avenue, from there all the way down to Wheeler Avenue, was planted with 196 maple trees. Incredible maple trees, only about 12 feet apart on both sides of Maple Avenue. And going down Maple Avenue was like almost going into a tunnel. I was just a little kid, and I loved my dad and mother driving me down Maple Avenue, because on a hot, bright summer afternoon, you'd suddenly hit Maple Avenue, and there was just this tunnel of trees. And of course, in the fall, those leaves turning golden. I mean, it was magic. And Linden Place place, the fragrance of the linden trees. I mean, this village was just, and we had a very far-sighted mayor by the name of Wisner, who was helping stimulate this as well. He too was very aesthetically minded. He was an artist, he was an architect, he was a mayor, he inherited a lot of money from coal fortune out in Pennsylvania, even though his ancestors came from Warwick. He came back from Pennsylvania, settled here because he loved Warwick so much. Helped to finance what became the Red Swan Inn, where the country club is now. That becomes beautifully landscaped in the first decade of the 20th century. So you have all these people converging with different ideas, different exposures to horticulture, to trees, to natural beauty. And so we can be extremely proud that Warwick has really a unique tradition of this. I mean, it really it doesn't surprise me at all that, when was it, 3 years ago when we won an international award for the beauty? I can't remember what that award was called, but Communities in Bloom, yeah. And people from different parts of the world came as judges, and they were blown away by what they saw here. Blown away by it. And so these traditions continue to, well, they get back to the Sanfords. The Sanfords, their fortune, the Horton fortune, through the marriage, they build, or they have a beautiful home off of Fifth Avenue. In the neighborhood, there are other Warwick families that have their huge townhouses around the Metropolitan Museum off of Fifth Avenue in the 60s. They build these opulent townhouses, but they scurry back to Warwick whenever they have a chance to get out here to the countryside. And the Lewises did the same. The Sanford, Horton Lewises did the same. They had their beautiful home in New York, but they spent an awful lot of time out here. And I often wondered when Elizabeth Sanford married Madison Lewis, they were thinking about moving out to East Hampton, because East Hampton was getting to be the Tony community. And a lot of the wealthy people were now beginning to build summer cottages out in East Hampton. Nothing to do with it. Oh no, we want to come back to Warwick. We want to live here. So they buy the estate, well, two estates, I guess. Jeffrey Amherst Wisner's estate, and what was the other estate?
Chamberlain.
Chamberlain estate, thank you, exactly. They combine the two. They unfortunately tear down the Wisner house, because the Wisner house was really an architectural gem. It had an indoor greenhouse. I mean, it was really spectacular. But that house went, and they came to call their estate Windhurst. And of course, the Chamberlain house remains. It's the big white house going up the road here. And Lee herself becomes interested in gardening and in horticulture. And she becomes a driving force in what comes to be called the Garden Club of Orange and Dutchess County. She has a lot of friends from New York who have their estates over in Dutchess County, and the ladies from Orange County and from Dutchess County got together to form this garden club. And she and many other Warwick women become very active in that garden club. And she devotes much of her energy and time to gardening. Now, what happens is that Fowler dies in 1950, Thomas Fowler. His wife dies shortly thereafter. They had 9 children. The kids, they saw Bel Air as like a country club. Bel Air had everything. Bel Air had a billiards room. They had a bowling alley. They had a stable, horses, cows, sheep. I mean, this was a playground here. F. Scott Fitzgerald was a friend of one of the Fowler boys. Scott Fitzgerald would come up here. Weekends, they had huge parties, everybody get drunk. There's one story, Scott Fitzgerald, they take him down to the railroad station in Warwick, and they wish him farewell. For some reason, Zelda wasn't up that weekend. He gets on the train, and the train pulls away, bye, bye, bye. The train pulls away, and Scott had gotten on the train and walked to the other side of the train and walked down again, and the train left and he stayed. He said, I don't want to leave Warwick. I'm not going back to New York. And anyway, so Bel Air becomes this great playground, but it wasn't maintained. I think maybe the family, I really don't know. But that next generation, they just didn't have that kind of interest, I guess. They would come up less frequently, and I know by the time I was a kid, I believe 40s, that house looked like no one had been living in it for a number of years. I don't know, Gene, had it been unoccupied for several years?
I don't think so.
No? People were still coming up in the
Oh, I
winter?
think so, in the summer,
Well,
only in the summer.
But I've read that one of the reasons why they decided in 1952 to demolish the house was it was too costly. It wasn't insulated, and it was just expensive to keep it heated for the winter, and it was just the upkeep and everything else, and getting help and so forth. The Second World War came, 1930s and 40s. The gardens began to deteriorate, and in 1966, Madison and Lewis buy the property. They buy the property, and they develop part of it. They subdivide it, and they create what is called Robin Bray. Robin Bray got its name from the Amherst estate, which, as I said, been across the street, and was sandwiched in by the Chamberlain estate on one side and the former Dunning estate on the other. And here was the Wisdom estate. So they bought the property, subdivided it, and then donated a large chunk of the estate, including this wooded area, the woodlands, to Lee's favorite club for gardening. And so the Garden Club of Orange and Dutchess counties takes it over in 1966, begins to build an outdoor classroom in Warwick, in Lewis Woodlands. It comes to be called Lewis Woodlands. And they build this beautiful set of plant, or I should say they plant all kinds of flowers and ferns, and they send schools, classes up there with their teachers. They developed a wonderful guide to the Lewis Woodlands in 1971, indicating all the plantings and the history of the area and so forth, and the Blair estate, and former Blair estate. But what began to happen was, and my wife will slit my throat for saying this perhaps, is the members of the garden club got progressively older. And it got to be more and more of a chore to keep this place up. It got to be harder and harder to get volunteers to go out there and do the work that was necessary. And it fell into a bit of disuse and disrepair. And so finally and reluctantly, they decided to approach the village authorities. And Michael, I guess you were mayor at the time, weren't you? To approach Michael, and a wonderful arrangement was made where the title would transfer for $1, I think, to the village. And that's how Lewis Woodlands became part of the village park. And so that's the history of it in a nutshell. I haven't looked at my watch, but I run overtime. I'm sorry, Sharon. And I want to thank Sharon Knoll, by the way, for hosting this tonight, and for being the director of the Warwick Historical Society, and helping to make this happen this evening. And of course, the Warwick Valley Gardeners have played a very important role in all of this, and so have the Sustainable Warwick has played a role here, and the Warwick Historical Society. So our thanks go out to all of them. Yes.
You mentioned earlier that there was a cave that went from the
Behind the landmark.
landmark all the way down into the woodlands, or right?
Well, beyond, I think just not too far behind the gas station across the street.
Right, that's it. Is
Right.
it still there?
Well, it's probably still there, but, kids were getting into it. And there was a question of liability. And the Sanfords decided I think it was the Sanfords made the decision to shut it down.
Block it off?
Block it off. So it hasn't, I don't know of anyone other than, Jane, did you ever get into that? Did you ever go into the chamber?
Part way.
Part way. There are very few people
Think the mayor
around
did,
now
but I don't
that can attest to that. Michael, did you ever get into
Oh,
that?
yeah, absolutely.
You did?
I smoked my first cigarette there.
That's probably why they closed it.
But, you know, it was called the Seven Room Caves, at least when I was a kid.
7 rooms?
Yeah.
Amazing.
And Mr. Hansen was the tour guide, usually.
George Hansen.
Yeah. And if I ever told my mother that we went into a hole in the earth and then came out, you know,
Down in the village here.
she would.
Right.
Some things like are secrets, right?
Exactly. And Warwick Woodlands has been a place of magic, of mystery, of secrets, of legends, of love, of family connections, of all kinds of things. And that's why tonight, I'm not a horticulturalist, and I said to myself, you know, I really can't speak to you people because you're into this all the time. But what I can tell you is some of the history, the prehistory, the history, and the families, the peoples who played a role in what would ultimately evolve into the Lewis Woodlands. And if you haven't been over there, you really must. Oh, yeah, there's one other thing. I just took a walk through there the other day with Jeffrey Howard, who's been a driving force in sustainable Warwick, and that wonderful community garden that he and a group have established down by the old school on Hamilton Avenue. There is a mound there on the right-hand side. When you get to the rock cairn that I described, the boundary line, you make a left, you begin to ascend the hill there. The right-hand side is a mound. Well, that used to be a charcoal making facility. And there was some weird fellow, and I never was able to find his name, but some very eccentric guy who apparently was a single man, and he used to make charcoal up there and sell it in bags down here in the village. And that was probably in the 1860s or 70s, obviously before the Fowlers bought the property. But evidence of that charcoal facility are still there as well. So there are a lot of things that we're still learning about Warwick Woodlands. I don't think we have the answers to everything, and we may never have the answers. But that, again, is what makes that place so exciting. So I think I'll end here, and I want to introduce Jane Hamburger. Jane and Pat and Gert and so many of you have already put a tremendous amount of energy into the Lewis Woodlands, which, by the way, the Lewis Woodlands is so important as an educational facility. That is where we need to train the future generation to understand, appreciate, and to love the natural world. Wildlife, that's the place. That's like a school. Lewis Woodlands is like our outdoor school. And we have to see it that way. We have to encourage young people to visit and to study it. It's essential that we do that. That's part of this legacy, going back to the Indian period. We've got to keep that legacy alive. That's our responsibility to do that. So I want to stop here and turn things over to Jane, and she's going to, I think, say a few things about the future.
Thank you so much, Professor Hull. Listening to you tonight, I can start to understand a little why when you walk into the Lewis Woodlands, you feel the presence of history, of all those things that went on. It really is something. And our introduction to it, I'm one of those older gardeners who is trying to get youth involved in Lewis Woodlands as an educational place. Tonight was actually step 2 of what we have done as a 3-pronged approach. Step 1 being the Arbor Day ceremony. Tonight's step 2, and then step 3. All of this is about a project that we have that we're calling Welcome to Lewis Woodlands. Welcome community, welcome pollinators, welcome families. Come to the Lewis Woodlands, and we've planned over a series of 5 Sundays in each month, what this flyer describes. Activities to involve the youth in planting a pollinator's garden, which is of special interest to the Warwick Valley gardeners. To plant, to care, you can better bet they're going to keep gardeners' journals, so I can't wait to get my hands on and look at that. Witches Creek will certainly figure large in what we do, and many other experiences in the arts. We're going to create sculptures from nature. We're going to make music of nature and our own. We're going to dance and move as nature does. And finally, on the last September, when we put the garden to bed, we'll be having a plein air demonstration for those people who want to come and paint their garden